November 9th, 1979. Airborne 36 hours, Mountain Time. North American Aerospace Defense Command Operations Center, Cheyenne Mountain Complex, Colorado Springs, Colorado. Senior Controller Lieutenant Colonel John Pickford watched his primary display screen transition from its normal green tactical map, showing routine air traffic over North America, to a sea of red icons erupting across the Soviet Union. The first icon appeared at 01:36:03, then 10 more, then 50, then hundreds. Each red icon represented a detected ballistic missile launch. Within 30 seconds, Pickford's screen showed 547 launches from Soviet ICBM fields. Within 60 seconds, 1,143 launches. Within 90 seconds, 2,200 launches covering every ICBM silo, every missile submarine, every launch facility in the Soviet arsenal. The computer-generated voice announcement system, designed to verbally alert controllers to critical events, began its mechanical recitation. Warning. Multiple missile launch detected. Warning. Multiple missile launch detected. The voice repeated every 3 seconds, creating an audio backdrop of mechanical urgency that filled the operations center. Pickford had been on duty at NORAD for 7 hours. He had managed 34 false alarms during his career at Cheyenne Mountain, weather satellites misidentified as launches, radar glitches showing phantom contacts, computer processing errors generating spurious warnings. Every false alarm had been resolved within seconds through standard verification procedures. This was different. The satellite infrared data displayed on his secondary monitor showed heat signatures consistent with missile launches across the Soviet Union. The ballistic missile early warning system radars at Thule, Greenland and Clear, Alaska were reporting radar returns consistent with ICBMs on ballistic trajectories toward North America. The computer projection system was calculating impact points, Minuteman ICBM fields in Montana, North Dakota and Wyoming, SAC bomber bases across the central United States, NORAD itself. Estimated time to first impact, 27 minutes. Pickford reached for the direct line to the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon. His hand was steady. His voice was calm. But his mind was processing a reality that 7 years of training had prepared him for, but that he had never truly believed would occur. The Soviet Union had launched a full-scale nuclear attack against the United States. What Lieutenant Colonel Pickford did not know, what no one in the operations center knew, what no one at the Pentagon or the White House knew, was that the 2,200 missile launches displayed on every screen at NORAD were not real. They were a training scenario, exercise scenario 437B, loaded onto a magnetic tape created in 1977 to test NORAD's response to a maximum threat coordinated Soviet strike. The tape had been loaded into the operational computer system by mistake. A computer operator performing routine maintenance, working in the dim lighting of the computer room at 01:20 hours, had grabbed the wrong tape from a storage rack. He had loaded an exercise tape into the system that processed real sensor data from satellites and radars, watching for Soviet attack. The tape contained 1,247,863 data records, simulating exactly what the system was designed to detect: the end of the world. And for the next 11 minutes, everyone at NORAD, at the Pentagon, at the White House, would believe that World War III had begun. To understand how a training tape nearly started a nuclear war, one must understand the strategic environment of November 1979, the early warning systems NORAD operated, and the hair-trigger alert posture that maintained American nuclear forces ready to launch within minutes of detecting Soviet attack. The Cold War in November 1979 existed in a state of heightened tension following the relative calm of mid-decade détente. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty II, signed by President Carter and Soviet Premier Brezhnev in June 1979, faced strong opposition in the U.S. Senate. Conservative senators argued the treaty favored Soviet interests and failed to adequately constrain Soviet strategic modernization programs. The Soviet military, in 1979, was at the peak of its Cold War power. The Soviet strategic rocket forces operated 398 intercontinental ballistic missiles, 308 SS-18 Satan missiles, each carrying 10 750-kiloton warheads, 330 SS-19 Stiletto missiles, each carrying 6 550-kiloton warheads, 360 SS-11 Seago missiles with single 1-megaton warheads, and 400 older systems. Total Soviet ICBM warheads, approximately 5,500. The Soviet Navy operated 62 ballistic missile submarines, carrying 950 submarine-launched ballistic missiles with approximately 2,800 At any moment, approximately 15 to 20 Soviet SSBNs were on patrol in the Atlantic and Pacific, within range of American targets. Soviet strategic bomber forces consisted of approximately 150 Tu-95 Bear and Tu-160 Blackjack bombers capable of reaching North America. Total Soviet strategic nuclear warheads in November 1979, approximately 9,000. American strategic forces in November 1979 consisted of 1,054 Minuteman ICBMs, 450 Minuteman III missiles carrying 3 170-kiloton warheads each, 504 Minuteman II missiles with single 1.2 megaton warheads, 100 older Minuteman IB systems. Total American ICBM warheads, approximately 2-150. The U.S. Navy operated 41 ballistic missile submarines carrying 656 submarine-launched ballistic missiles with approximately 5,120 warheads. At any moment, approximately 20 American SSBNs were on patrol. The Strategic Air Command Bomber Force consisted of 316 B-52 Stratofortresses and 65 FB-111 medium bombers, carrying a total of approximately 3,000 nuclear weapons. Total American strategic nuclear warheads in November 1979, approximately 10,000. This arsenal existed in a command and control structure designed for rapid response. American nuclear doctrine in 1979 emphasized launch on warning, or launch under attack, the capability to launch retaliatory forces after detecting enemy attack but before incoming warheads arrived and destroyed American launch capabilities. The logic was straightforward. Soviet ICBMs required approximately 30 minutes to fly from launch sites in the Soviet Union to targets in the United States. Soviet SLBMs, fired from submarines off American coasts, required 10 to 15 minutes to reach targets. If American strategic forces waited for confirmed impacts before launching, Soviet warheads would destroy those forces, eliminating America's ability to retaliate. Launch on warning required detecting Soviet launches within seconds, transmitting that information to the National Command Authority within minutes, obtaining presidential authorization for retaliation within minutes, and launching American forces before Soviet warheads arrived. The entire decision cycle, from detection to launch, was designed to complete within 10 to 15 minutes. This compressed timeline created extraordinary pressure on early warning systems. Those systems had to be sensitive enough to detect launches immediately, but discriminating enough to avoid false alarms that could trigger accidental nuclear war. The balance was precarious, too sensitive, and the system generated false alarms. Too cautious, and the system might miss a real attack, costing the critical minutes needed for retaliation. NORAD, established in 1958 as a joint US-Canadian command, operated the early warning systems that maintained this balance. And on November 9, 1979, those systems would fail in a way that came within minutes of triggering the very nuclear war they were designed to deter. The North American Aerospace Defense Command occupied a facility unique in military architecture, an underground city carved into Cheyenne Mountain, 2,000 feet beneath the granite peak. The complex, completed in 1966 at a cost of $142 million, consisted of 15 buildings housed in man-made caverns excavated from solid rock. The buildings sat on massive steel springs designed to isolate them from shock, enabling the facility to survive a direct hit from a 30-megaton thermonuclear weapon detonating at the surface. Access to the complex required passing through a 25-ton blast door, 3.5 feet thick, mounted on tracks that allowed it to seal the entrance tunnel in seconds. The blast door could withstand overpressure of 30 pounds per square inch and thermal radiation exceeding 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Once sealed, the complex was self-sufficient with air filtration systems, water supplies, and diesel generators capable of sustaining 1,000 personnel for 30 days without external support. The operations center, the heart of NORAD, measured 140 feet long by 70 feet wide by 35 feet tall. 3 massive display screens, each 20 feet wide by 15 feet tall, dominated the front wall. The screens displayed tactical maps showing North America, the Soviet Union, and global air and missile activity. Below the main screens, rows of smaller displays and computer consoles stretched across the room, each manned by controllers monitoring specific aspects of aerospace defense. The controllers sat at 4 tiers of consoles arranged in a semicircle facing the main screens. The first tier, closest to the screens, housed senior controllers responsible for overall situational assessment. The second and third tiers contained specialists monitoring satellite data, radar returns, communications, and computer systems. The fourth tier, elevated at the back of the room, held the command section where the senior duty officer, typically a colonel or brigadier general, oversaw operations. On November 9, 1979, the night shift manning the operations center consisted of 47 personnel, 1 senior duty officer, 5 senior controllers, 24 console operators, 12 communications specialists, and 5 computer technicians. Lieutenant Colonel John Pickford, a 43-year-old Air Force officer with 21 years of service, held the senior controller position at Console 1, responsible for initial assessment and verification of missile attack warnings. The early warning data feeding the operations center came from 3 primary sources, each providing overlapping coverage designed to confirm detections and eliminate false alarms. The Defense Support Program satellites, designated DSP, formed the first layer of detection. 5 satellites in geosynchronous orbit, positioned 22,300 miles above Earth, used infrared sensors to detect the heat signatures of launching ballistic missiles. A Soviet SS-18 ICBM at liftoff generated approximately 2,500 tons of thrust, producing an infrared signature visible to DSP sensors within 90 seconds of ignition. The satellites transmitted detection data to ground stations at Buckley Air National Guard Base in Colorado and Noongar in Australia, which processed the data and relayed it to NORAD within 60 seconds of detection. DSP satellites could detect a single missile launch. They could distinguish between ICBM launches, SLBM launches, and satellite launches based on the trajectory and acceleration profiles of the infrared signatures. The system was extraordinarily sensitive, capable of detecting launches anywhere on Earth regardless of weather conditions. The Ballistic Missile Early Warning System radars, designated BMEWS, formed the second detection layer. 3 massive phased-array radar installations at Thule Air Base, Greenland, Clear Air Force Station, Alaska, and RAF Fylingdales Moor, England, provided coverage of potential ICBM approach corridors from the Soviet Union toward North America. Each BMEWS radar could detect missiles at ranges exceeding 3,000 miles, providing 15 to 20 minutes of warning before impact. BMEWS radars operated at 420 MHz frequency with peak power output of 5 megawatts. Each radar could track hundreds of targets simultaneously, calculating trajectories and predicting impact points. The radars were designed to provide confirmation of DSP satellite detections, offering independent verification that detected infrared signatures corresponded to actual missiles on ballistic trajectories. The PAVE-PAUSE radars, a newer system installed in the late 1970s, provided coverage of potential SLBM approach corridors. 2 installations at Beale Air Force Base, California, and Otis Air National Guard Base, Massachusetts, monitored the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans for submarine-launched missile threats. PAVE-PAUSE used phased array technology similar to BMEWS, but operated at higher frequencies and could detect smaller, lower trajectory SLBM launches that might evade satellite detection. The data from satellites and radars fed into NORAD's computer system, designated the 427M, a Philco 2000 mainframe installation occupying an entire building within the Cheyenne Mountain complex. The 427M processed incoming sensor data, correlated detections from multiple sources, calculated missile trajectories and impact points, assessed threat levels, and displayed information to Operations Center controllers. The 427M consisted of 4 mainframe units operating in parallel, providing redundancy and processing capacity. Each unit contained 256 kilobytes of core memory, considered substantial for 1979, and executed approximately 500,000 instructions per second. The system processed data from 147 sensors worldwide, generating approximately 1.2 million data points per minute during normal operations. Critical to the events of November 9th was the 427Me's use of magnetic tape for data storage and program loading. The system used industry-standard 9-track magnetic tapes, each capable of storing approximately 40 megabytes of data. Software updates, database modifications, and system diagnostics all involved physically loading tapes into tape drives located in the computer room adjacent to the operations center. The system also used training tapes for exercises. These tapes contained simulated sensor data representing various attack scenarios, from limited strikes involving dozens of missiles to maximum threat coordinated attacks involving thousands. The training tapes allowed NORAD to test response procedures, train new personnel, and evaluate system performance without using actual operational sensor networks. Training tapes were created to be realistic. They contained simulated DSP satellite data showing infrared signatures of missile launches. They contained simulated BMEWS radar data showing targets on ballistic trajectories. They contained simulated impact predictions and threat assessments. The scenarios were designed to be indistinguishable from real attacks, providing the most effective training possible. This realism created a vulnerability. If a training tape were accidentally loaded into the operational system, the simulated attack scenario would appear on Operations Center displays as if it were real. The controllers would see satellite data showing launches. They would see radar data showing missiles inbound. They would see computer projections showing impact points and times. Every indicator would suggest a genuine attack because the training tape was designed to simulate exactly that. The 427M included safeguards to prevent this scenario. Training tapes were stored separately from operational tapes. They carried clear labels identifying them as exercises. The tape data included headers that the computer system was designed to recognize, routing exercise data to separate displays isolated from operational systems. Multiple procedural and technical safeguards existed to prevent training data from appearing on operational displays. On November 9, 1979, every one of those safeguards would fail. November 9, 1979 began as a routine night shift at NORAD. The operations center transitioned from day shift to night shift at 2200 hours on November 8th. Lieutenant Colonel Pickford assumed his position at Console 1 at 2145 hours, receiving briefing from the outgoing senior controller. The briefing covered current threat status, scheduled satellite passes, planned communications tests, and maintenance activities. Nothing unusual. Standard procedures for a standard night. The overnight shift, running from 2200 hours to 600 hours, typically experienced lower activity levels than day shifts. Global air traffic decreased. Routine communications and tests were scheduled to avoid interfering with peak operational periods. The reduced tempo allowed time for maintenance activities that required taking system components offline. At 100 hours on November 9th, 3 hours into the shift, the operations center was quiet. Display screens showed normal conditions. Satellite data indicated no unusual Soviet military activity. BMEWS radars tracked routine air traffic. Nothing suggested that within 36 minutes the United States would believe it was under the largest nuclear attack in history. At 01:15 hours, a maintenance request arrived from the computer room. A software update for the 427 MN system was scheduled for implementation during the night shift, when data processing loads were lightest. The update involved loading new trajectory calculation algorithms designed to improve accuracy in predicting impact points for missiles on depressed trajectories. Senior Computer Operator Technical Sergeant William J. Moorman received the maintenance assignment. Moorman, 28 years old, had 4 years of experience operating NORAD computer systems. He held a secret security clearance, had completed advanced technical training at Keesler Air Force Base, and had performed dozens of software updates during his tenure at Cheyenne Mountain. He was qualified, experienced, and competent. The procedure for implementing software updates was documented in Technical Order 55M-1B33, a manual specifying every step in precise detail. Moorman retrieved the manual and began the procedure at 188 hours. Step 1. Retrieve the software update tape from secure storage. Moorman walked to the tape storage area, a locked room adjacent to the computer room containing hundreds of magnetic tapes organized in floor-to-ceiling racks. The storage room lighting was functional but dim, designed to reduce heat generation in the confined space. The tapes were organized by category and date, with labels facing outward for identification. Software update tapes occupied Rack 3, Section B. Training tapes occupied Rack 5, Section C, approximately 15 feet away. Moorman approached Rack 3, Section B, and scanned the tape labels looking for 422.7 Software Update version 12.4, November 1979. The labels were white with black text, standard format, approximately 3 inches wide by 2 inches tall. The text was small, designed to fit identifying information in limited space. In the dim lighting, with dozens of similar tapes visible, Moorman located what he believed was the correct tape. He pulled it from the rack and returned to the computer room. He did not turn on additional lighting. He did not examine the label closely. He had performed this procedure many times. He grabbed the tape, returned to his station, and proceeded with the update. At 01:20 hours, Moorman began implementing the software update according to Technical Order 55M-1B33. Step 2. Shut down non-essential processing on Computer Unit 3 to prepare for software load. Moorman entered the shutdown commands. Unit 3's non-essential processes terminated, leaving only core monitoring functions active. The shutdown did not affect Operations Center displays. 3 other computer units continued processing sensor data normally. Step 3. Load software update tape into designated tape drive. Moorman loaded the tape he had retrieved into tape drive 4, a drive reserved for maintenance operations. The drive accepted the tape, threaded it onto the red mechanism, and indicated readiness to begin loading data. Step 4. Initiate tape load process. Moorman entered the command, load tape drive 4 to Unit 3. The computer began reading data from the tape and loading it into Unit 3's memory. At 01:25 hours, 5 minutes into the load process, Moorman's console displayed a warning message. Data format mismatch. Verify tape identity. This was the first safeguard activating. The 427mm system, examining the data being loaded, detected that the format did not match the expected structure for a software update. The system was designed to recognize different data types and reject incompatible formats. Moorman read the warning. He had encountered similar warnings during previous software updates. Sometimes new software versions included structural changes that triggered format mismatch warnings. The warnings were typically informational rather than critical. Standard procedure when encountering such warnings was to verify the tape identity and, if correct, override the warning to continue the load. Moorman verified the tape identity by checking the label on the physical tape. The label read, Exercise Scenario 437B, Maximum Coordinated Strike. But Moorman, reading the label in dim lighting while focused on completing his maintenance task, misread it. He saw 437 and associated it with software version numbers. He saw coordinated and thought of system coordination functions. His expectation that he was loading a software update created a cognitive bias that influenced his perception of the label. He saw what he expected to see, rather than what was actually written. Satisfied that he had verified the tape identity, Moorman entered the override command, Continue Load, Override Format Check. The computer accepted the override. This was the second safeguard failing. Computer operators had authority to override format warnings because legitimate software updates sometimes triggered such warnings. The authority was necessary for maintaining system flexibility, but it also meant that an operator, through misreading or misjudgment, could bypass the safeguard designed to prevent exactly what was happening, loading incompatible data into the operational system. At 01:32 hours, the tape load completed. Moorman's console displayed, Load Complete. 1,247,863 data records processed. Moorman verified that Computer Unit 3 had restarted successfully after the load. The unit's status indicators showed green. All systems functional. Moorman logged the maintenance action as complete in the computer operations logbook. 0132 HRs, software update, V12.4, loaded to Unit 3, system operational. Now he moved to his next scheduled task, unaware that he had just loaded Exercise Scenario 437B, a training tape simulating 2,200 Soviet missile launches, into the computer unit that fed data to every display screen in the NORAD Operations Center. At 35 hours, Computer Unit 3, having completed its restart sequence after the tape load, began processing the data it had received. The unit, designed to process sensor data from satellites and radars, encountered a massive dataset containing simulated DSP satellite detections, simulated BMEW's radar returns, and simulated trajectory calculations. The computer had no context for recognizing this data as simulated. The safeguard designed to distinguish exercise data from operational data relied on tape headers that should have routed exercise data to training displays. But Moorman's override had bypassed that safeguard. The data was now in the operational system, and Computer Unit 3 processed it as it would process any sensor data. It calculated trajectories, predicted impact points, assessed threat levels, and prepared to display the information to Operations Center controllers. At 01:36 hours, 0 seconds, Computer Unit 3 completed its processing and transmitted results to the Operations Center display system. At 01:36 hours, 3 seconds, Lieutenant Colonel John Pickford's display screen at Console 1 showed the first missile launch detection. A single red icon appeared on the tactical map over the Soviet Union, near the location of known SS-18 ICBM fields. At 01:36 hours, 6 seconds, 10 more icons appeared. At 01:36 hours, 9 seconds, 50 more. At 01:36 hours, 15 seconds, the computer voice announcement system activated. Warning, multiple missile launch detected. At 01:36 hours, 30 seconds, Pickford's screen showed 547 launch detections. The tactical map of the Soviet Union was covered with red icons, each representing a detected ICBM launch. The icons were color-coded, bright red for recently detected launches, darker red for older detections. The screen was now predominantly bright red. Pickford's first reaction was disbelief. This had to be a system malfunction. Soviet doctrine called for launching missiles in waves to optimize penetration of American defenses. Simultaneous launch of hundreds of missiles was not consistent with known Soviet war plans. But Pickford's training overrode disbelief. Verify first, assess second. At 01:36 hours, 40 seconds, Pickford called out to the operations center. All stations, confirm your displays. I'm showing multiple Soviet launches. Verify with your sensor data. Console operators checked their displays. Console 2, monitoring DSP satellite data, reported satellite infrared detections confirmed. Multiple launches from Soviet ICBM fields, count now exceeding 800. Console 3, monitoring BMEW's radar at Thule, reported Thule radar shows multiple contacts, trajectories consistent with ICBMs inbound. Count now exceeding 1,000. At 01:37 hours, the launch count reached 1,400. The display now showed not only ICBM launches from Soviet territory, but also SLBM launches from submarines off both American coasts. The scenario on Exercise Scenario 437B was designed to simulate maximum threat. Every Soviet ICBM launching simultaneously, every Soviet submarine launching all missiles simultaneously. The scenario represented the absolute worst case, a coordinated surprise attack designed to destroy American retaliatory forces before they could respond. At 01:37 hours, 15 seconds, the launch count reached 1,800. Console 5, running preliminary trajectory calculations, reported, Sir, projected targets include all Minuteman fields, all SAC bomber bases, and NORAD itself. Estimated time to first impact, 26 minutes. Pickford made the decision that protocol required. This was either the largest false alarm in NORAD history, or it was World War III. Either way, the National Command Authority needed to know immediately. At 01:37 hours, 30 seconds, Pickford reached for the red phone, the direct line to the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon. The line connected instantly. Navy Captain James R. Corsetti, senior duty officer at the NMCC, answered, NMCC, secure line. Pickford spoke with the calm, measured tone that training had drilled into him. NMCC, this is NORAD operations. Missile attack warning. We are detecting large-scale Soviet launch activity. Count now exceeding 1,800 missiles. Satellite and radar confirmation. Estimated time to impact 26 minutes. There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds. Then Corsetti responded, NORAD, NMCC copies missile attack warning. Confirm, you are reporting 1,800 Soviet missiles inbound? Affirmative, NMCC. Count is now 2,000 and may still be climbing. This appears to be a coordinated strike targeting our retaliatory forces. At 01:38 hours, the National Military Command Center activated emergency action procedures. Within seconds, alerts transmitted to every military command in the United States. At Minuteman ICBM fields in Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming, klaxons began wailing, their distinctive warbling tone alerting missile crews to man their launch control centers. At Strategic Air Command bomber bases across the central United States, sirens activated, sending bomber crews sprinting to their aircraft. At submarine communication stations, emergency action messages prepared for transmission to ballistic missile submarines on patrol. At 1:38 hours, 30 seconds, the count on Pickford's display stabilized at 2,200 launches. The scenario was complete. Exercise scenario 437B simulated 1,400 ICBM launches and 800 SLBM launches, representing essentially the entire Soviet strategic arsenal launching in a coordinated first strike. Pickford stared at his display. 3,200 missiles. The number was impossible. The Soviet Union had never conducted exercises involving simultaneous launch of more than a few dozen missiles. Combat doctrine called for sequential waves. Intelligence had never suggested Soviet capability for coordinating simultaneous launch of thousands of missiles. But the data was there. Satellite infrared detections, confirmed. BMEW's radar returns, confirmed. Computer trajectory calculations, confirmed. Every sensor, every system, every verification method showed the same result. 2,200 Soviet missiles inbound. At 1:39 hours at the Pentagon, Captain Corsetti briefed the senior officer present, Air Force Brigadier General William F. Burns. Burns listened to the report and made the decision to notify the National Security Advisor. Protocol required informing the President of missile attack warnings, but with 25 minutes to estimated impact, time was critical. Burns ordered notification of National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, while simultaneously preparing to contact President Carter. At 1:39 hours, 30 seconds, Brzezinski's military aide, Army Colonel William Odom, placed a call to Brzezinski's residence in northwest Washington, D.C. The phone rang 4 times before Brzezinski answered, his voice heavy with sleep. "Yes, what is it?" Odom spoke quickly. "Dr. Brzezinski, we have a missile attack warning from NORAD. The report indicates 2,000 Soviet missiles inbound. Estimated time to impact is 25 minutes. Brzezinski, instantly awake, sat up in bed. His wife, Emily, stirred beside him. Brzezinski kept his voice calm. "Give me the confidence assessment. Is this real?" Odom responded. "Sir, NORAD reports satellite and radar confirmation. The numbers are extraordinarily high, which is unusual, but all sensor data correlates. I'm preparing to notify the President now." Brzezinski made a calculation. If this was real, the President had perhaps 10 minutes to decide whether to order retaliation before Soviet warheads began destroying American command and control capabilities. But if this was a false alarm, waking the President with a recommendation to launch nuclear weapons would be the worst possible error. "Hold on, notification to the President. Give me 2 minutes. I'm calling NMCC directly for highest confidence assessment before we wake him." At 1:40 hours, Brzezinski called the National Military Command Center. General Burns briefed him on NORAD's report. Brzezinski asked the critical question, "General, what is your confidence level that this attack is real?" Burns paused before answering. "Sir, NORAD shows 2,200 inbound. All sensors confirm, but I'll be honest, the numbers seem impossibly high. Soviet doctrine doesn't support simultaneous launch of their entire arsenal. This is either a real attack using tactics we don't anticipate, or it's the most comprehensive false alarm we've ever experienced. How long until you can verify one way or the other?" "Sir, if Soviet missiles are actually inbound, BMEWS radars should be tracking them now with high precision. If this is false sensor data, the radar tracks won't match realistic trajectories. I'm having NORAD run detailed analysis now. I should have an answer in 3 to 5 minutes." Brzezinski checked his bedside clock. 1:40 hours. In 5 minutes, it would be 01:45. With 25 minutes to impact, that left 20 minutes to make the decision to launch. Barely enough time. Keep me informed every minute. And General, if we're going to recommend launch, we need absolute certainty. At 01:41 hours, back at NORAD, Lieutenant Colonel Pickford was conducting exactly the analysis General Burns had described. Something about the display data didn't fit. Pickford examined the launch detection data in detail. Every Soviet ICBM silo showed a launch within a 90-second window. Every Soviet submarine showed simultaneous launch of all missiles. The coordination was perfect. Too perfect. Pickford had studied Soviet doctrine extensively. He knew that Soviet strategic planning emphasized launching missiles in carefully timed waves to complicate American defensive responses and maximize the number of warheads penetrating to targets. Launching everything simultaneously violated that doctrine. It made no strategic sense. At 01:41 hours, 30 seconds, Pickford instructed Console 6 to pull up the detailed sensor metadata, the underlying data structure of the satellite and radar detections. Console 6 operator Captain Richard Hollins began examining the metadata. At 01:42 hours, Hollins noticed something anomalous. Sir, the launch detection IDs are sequential. Contact 001, Contact 002, Contact 003, proceeding in perfect numerical order. Real detections wouldn't sequence like that. Real launches would generate detection IDs based on satellite timing and position, which would be essentially random. Pickford felt his stomach tighten. Sequential IDs suggested the data was artificially generated. But from where? How could artificial data appear on systems processing real sensor feeds? At 01:42 hours, 30 seconds, Pickford called the computer room. Computer ops, this is Operations Center. Are you running any exercises or tests that could be feeding data to our displays? Technical Sergeant Moorman, still in the computer room, responded, "Negative, sir. I completed a software update at 01:32 hours. All units are operational. No exercises scheduled." What software update? Describe exactly what you loaded. Software update version 12.4, sir. Loaded to Unit 3. Completed at 01:32 hours without errors. Pickford checked his console. Unit 3 was indeed the source of the missile attack data populating the displays. Get down here immediately and bring the tape you loaded. At 01:43 hours, Moorman arrived in the operations center carrying the magnetic tape. He handed it to Pickford. Pickford read the label under the bright lights of the operations center. The label read, "Exercise Scenario 437B, Maximum Coordinated Strike, Training Use Only, Not for Operational Systems." Pickford felt a wave of relief so powerful it was physically disorienting. This was a false alarm. A training tape had been loaded into the operational system. There was no Soviet attack. The TW-200 missiles were simulated. America was not at war. At 01:43 hours, 30 seconds, Pickford reached for the red phone. "NMCC, NORAD operations. Disregard previous missile attack warning. I say again, disregard previous warning. We have identified the source of false data. An exercise tape was inadvertently loaded into our operational computer system. There is no Soviet attack. All displays showing inbound missiles are based on training scenario data, not real sensor data." D. At the Pentagon, General Burns received the message and immediately called Brzezinski. "Dr. Brzezinski, NORAD has identified this as a false alarm. A training tape was loaded into their computer system by mistake. There is no attack. I repeat, no attack." Brzezinski, still sitting on the edge of his bed, phone in hand, felt relief flood through him. "Confirm that, General. Absolute confirmation. No Soviet launches?" "Confirmed, sir. I'm having independent verification run now through direct sensor checks, but NORAD has identified the error source. I'm issuing stand-down orders to all forces." At 0144 hours, stand-down orders transmitted across the U.S. military. At ICBM fields, missile crews received the order. False alarm, return to normal alert status. At bomber bases, crews shut down aircraft engines and returned to ready rooms. At submarine communication stations, the emergency action messages were cancelled. At 145 hours, 9 minutes after the first launch detection appeared on displays, the NORAD Operations Center returned to normal operations. The display screens cleared of red icons. The computer voice announcement system fell silent. Controllers began the process of documenting the incident for investigation. In the computer room, Technical Sergeant Moorman stood staring at the tape in his hand. Exercise Scenario 437B. He had grabbed the wrong tape. He had loaded a training scenario into the operational system. He had convinced everyone that Russia had launched 2,200 missiles. At 0147 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Pickford initiated the incident report. The report would document every second of the false alarm, every decision made, every communication sent. The investigation would take weeks. The consequences would reshape NORAD procedures for decades. But in that moment, Pickford focused on the essential fact. For 9 minutes, the United States had believed it was under nuclear attack. And for 9 minutes, the world had balanced on the edge of nuclear war. What prevented escalation from false alarm to actual launch was a combination of 3 factors. First, Pickford's insistence on verification despite overwhelming sensor confirmation. Second, the anomalous sequencing of contact IDs that revealed the data as artificial. Third, Brzezinski's decision to demand highest confidence assessment before recommending launch to the president. If any one of those factors had been different, if Pickford had accepted the sensor data without deep analysis, if the contact IDs had been randomized, if Brzezinski had immediately called Carter and recommended launch, the outcome could have been catastrophic. The timeline of what would have occurred if Brzezinski had recommended launch and President Carter had authorized retaliation can be constructed from nuclear war planning documents declassified in subsequent decades. At 0142 hours, if Brzezinski had called President Carter instead of calling NMCC for verification, Carter would have been briefed on the attack. 2,200 Soviet missiles inbound, 24 minutes to impact. Carter would have had approximately 8 minutes to decide whether to order launch of American strategic forces before communication with those forces might be severed by incoming Soviet warheads. At 0145 hours, approximately 3 minutes after being briefed, Carter would have authorized retaliatory launch, implementing the pre-planned nuclear war option designated Major Attack Option 2 in the single integrated operational plan. The authorization would have transmitted via encrypted communication channels to Strategic Air Command, reaching every ICBM field, every bomber base, every submarine communication station simultaneously. At 0147 hours, Minuteman ICBM launch crews at 150 launch control centers across Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming would have received valid launch orders, authenticated through the 2-person rule, requiring both the commander and deputy commander to verify codes and turn keys simultaneously. The launch control centers would have transmitted final launch commands to their assigned missiles. At 0149 hours, the first Minuteman III missiles would have ignited their first stage motors and begun rising from their silos. Within 60 seconds, approximately 450 Minuteman missiles would have launched from the central United States, each carrying 3 170-kiloton warheads programmed to strike Soviet ICBM fields, bomber bases, and command facilities. At 0150 hours, Soviet early warning satellites would have detected the American launches. The infrared signatures of 450 missiles lifting off across the central United States would have been unmistakable. Soviet command centers would have received alerts identical to what NORAD had received 9 minutes earlier. Massive American launch detected. At 0152 hours, Soviet General Staff would have briefed Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev on the American launch. Soviet nuclear doctrine, like American doctrine, emphasized launch on warning, with American missiles inbound requiring 25 to 30 minutes flight time to Soviet targets. Soviet leadership would have had approximately 10 minutes to decide whether to launch retaliatory forces. At 0155 hours, Soviet leadership, believing they were under American first strike, would have authorized launch of Soviet strategic forces. Approximately 1,400 Soviet ICBMs would have received launch orders. At 0158 hours, Soviet SS-18 and SS-19 ICBMs would have begun launching from silos across the Soviet Union. Within minutes, over 1,000 Soviet missiles carrying more than 5,000 warheads would have been in flight toward American targets. At 0230 hours, the first American Minuteman warheads would have impacted Soviet ICBM fields. Simultaneously, the first Soviet warheads would have impacted American ICBM fields. The silos hit earliest would have been those closest to the launch points, meaning missiles not yet launched would have been destroyed in their silos. At 0300 hours, 1 hour and 24 minutes after the false alarm began, approximately 6,000 nuclear warheads would have detonated across the United States, Soviet Union, and Allied territories in Europe and Asia. Major cities destroyed. Military installations destroyed. Command and control systems largely destroyed. Casualties exceeding 200 million immediately, with hundreds of millions more dying in subsequent weeks from radiation, fire, and infrastructure collapse. By 0400 hours, submarine-launched missiles would have begun arriving at targets not struck in the initial ICBM exchange. Secondary cities, industrial facilities, and any surviving military bases would have been hit by additional warheads. By dawn on November 9, 1979, approximately 3,000 to 4,000 nuclear weapons would have detonated across the Northern Hemisphere. The United States and Soviet Union would have ceased to exist as functioning societies. Global casualties would have exceeded 1 billion. Nuclear winter would have begun as smoke and soot from hundreds of burning cities rose into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight and causing global temperatures to plummet. This scenario, world-ending nuclear war, would have been triggered by Technical Sergeant Moorman grabbing the wrong tape from a storage rack in dim lighting at 0118 hours. The tape, Exercise Scenario 437B, cost approximately $12 to produce. The nuclear war it nearly started would have cost billions of lives. The margin separating continued existence of human civilization from nuclear holocaust on November 9, 1979, was 9 minutes of careful analysis, one controller noticing sequential contact IDs, and one national security advisor deciding to verify before recommending launch. The investigation into the November 9th incident began within hours of the false alarm resolution and continued for 6 months. The Air Force, the Department of Defense, the Defense Nuclear Agency, and congressional oversight committees all conducted reviews. The investigation identified multiple systemic failures that had allowed a training tape to enter the operational system and convince experienced personnel that nuclear war had begun. The physical storage of exercise tapes adjacent to operational tapes violated the principle of separation of functions. The investigation recommended immediate physical segregation, with exercise tapes moved to a separate locked room requiring supervisory authorization for access. The recommendation was implemented within 48 hours of the incident. The visual design of tape labels was inadequate for rapid, unambiguous identification under operational conditions. All labels used similar white backgrounds with black text in standard fonts. The investigation recommended complete redesign of labeling systems with color coding. Operational tapes would retain white labels. Exercise tapes would receive bright orange labels, measuring 4 inches tall by 6 inches wide, with exercise scenario, not for operational use, printed in 1-inch letters. The redesigned labels were implemented within 2 weeks. The tape header verification system failed because Sergeant Moorman's override command bypassed the safeguard entirely. The investigation found that override authority was too broadly granted. The recommendation was to restrict override commands to supervisory personnel, requiring a senior controller's authorization code in addition to the operator's command. This change required software modification, implemented within 30 days. The 427N computer system's inability to distinguish exercise data from operational data once the header check was overridden represented a fundamental design flaw. The investigation recommended implementing cryptographic verification of tape headers using encryption keys that would be mathematically impossible for unauthorized personnel to generate. Exercise tapes would be encrypted with keys that operational systems would actively reject, making it technically impossible to load exercise data into operational computers even with multiple override commands. This change required extensive software re-engineering completed within 6 months. The Operations Center display system provided no indication of data source. When exercise data appeared on operational displays, it looked identical to real sensor data. The investigation recommended adding data source indicators to all displays, with green borders indicating operational sensor data and orange borders indicating exercise data. The display modifications were implemented within 45 days. The training scenario realism, while necessary for effective exercises, created vulnerability when scenarios entered operational systems. The investigation recommended reducing scenario realism in certain aspects, specifically to make accidental operational loading more detectable. Sequential contact IDs, which had been the key to detecting the November 9th false alarm, would be mandated in all future training scenarios as a built-in signature distinguishing exercise data from real sensor data. The broader finding was that NORAD's early warning system, while technically sophisticated, remained vulnerable to human error, particularly when that error occurred in ways that defeated multiple safeguards simultaneously. The investigation identified this as a common mode failure, where a single error creates cascading effects across supposedly independent safety systems. The human factors analysis focused on Sergeant Moorman's error in grabbing the wrong tape. The investigation found no negligence. Moorman had followed documented procedures. The lighting in the tape storage room met military specifications. The tape labels met format standards. The error resulted from the combination of similar-appearing tapes stored in close proximity, read under time pressure in suboptimal lighting. The investigation concluded that the error was predictable and that system design, not individual performance, bore responsibility. Moorman received a written reprimand documented in his personnel file, but faced no criminal or administrative punishment. He was reassigned to computer operations duties not involving operational tape handling. He completed his enlistment in 1982 and left the Air Force. In interviews decades later, Moorman stated that he thought about the incident every day, wondering how his error could have caused World War III and feeling profound relief that the false alarm was detected before irreversible actions were taken. Lieutenant Colonel Pickford received commendation for his actions during the incident. His insistence on verification, despite apparent sensor confirmation, his detailed analysis that identified anomalous contact sequencing, and his calm management of the crisis represented exactly the human judgment that safeguarded nuclear systems against technical failures. Pickford continued at NORAD until 1983 and retired from the Air Force as a full colonel in 1987. National Security Advisor Brzezinski never publicly discussed the November 9th incident in detail during his time in government, but his memoirs, published years later, included a brief account. He wrote, "I came within minutes, perhaps seconds, of calling President Carter to recommend launching our nuclear forces against the Soviet Union. The only reason I hesitated was a lingering doubt about whether sensor data showing such a massive, perfectly coordinated attack could be real. That doubt saved the world, but I wonder how many other occasions, in America or the Soviet Union, similar doubts were insufficient, and how close we have come to ending civilization through accidents we'll never know about because they were resolved without public awareness." The November 9th incident was classified top secret for years after it occurred. The American public did not learn of the false alarm until details were leaked to the press in 1980. The revelation created political pressure for changes in nuclear command and control, contributing to debates about launch-on-warning posture and the risks of maintaining strategic forces on hair-trigger alert. The incident influenced Soviet thinking about American nuclear command procedures. Soviet intelligence, learning of the false alarm through their sources in the American government, analyzed the incident as evidence of American system vulnerability. Some Soviet military planners concluded that the United States might launch strategic forces in response to false warnings, increasing the risk that Soviet military activities could be misinterpreted and trigger American attack. This assessment may have contributed to Soviet caution during the Able Archer 83 crisis 4 years later, when Soviet leadership feared that a NATO exercise might be cover for a real attack. The November 9th false alarm was not unique. NORAD systems generated false alarms regularly throughout the Cold War. Between 1977 and 1984, the period bracketing the training tape incident, NORAD experienced 1,152 false alarms deemed serious enough to require senior commander assessment. Of these, 3 were considered critical, meaning they reached the level of alerting the National Command Authority. The other 2 critical false alarms occurred on June 3, 1980, and June 6, 1980, both caused by a faulty computer chip generating false data showing Soviet SLBM launches. These incidents, occurring less than 7 months after the training tape incident, further damaged confidence in early warning systems and prompted additional safeguard implementations. The broader pattern of false alarms raised fundamental questions about launch-on-warning doctrine. If early warning systems generated frequent false alarms, and if those false alarms could be sufficiently convincing to reach senior leadership, was maintaining nuclear forces ready to launch within minutes based on those warnings an acceptable risk? Proponents of launch-on-warning argued that the alternative was worse. Soviet first strike capability meant that American forces not launched before impact would be destroyed, eliminating deterrence. The risk of false alarm, while real, was manageable through verification procedures and human judgment. The November 9th incident, they argued, proved the system worked. The false alarm was detected and no launch occurred. Critics argued that the November 9th incident proved the opposite. Verification procedures and human judgment nearly failed. If Brzezinski had called the president first, instead of demanding additional verification, if the contact IDs had been randomized, if Pickford had accepted the sensor data without detailed analysis, the outcome would have been catastrophic. Relying on perfect human judgment under extreme time pressure with imperfect information was eventually certain to fail. This debate continued through the 1980s and influenced arms control negotiations. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty negotiations included discussions of improving early warning data sharing between the United States and Soviet Union, specifically to reduce the risk that false alarms in one country's systems could trigger nuclear war. The debate continues today. American and Russian strategic forces maintain alert postures similar to 1979, with ICBMs capable of launching within minutes. Early warning systems, while technologically improved, remain subject to technical failures and misinterpretation. The fundamental tension between maintaining credible deterrence and avoiding accidental war remains unresolved. The statistics of what was prevented by 9 minutes of verification procedure on November 9, 1979, quantify the margin by which human civilization survived. November 9, 1979. Incident summary. Incident start time, 0136, doctrine 03 hours. False alarm resolution, 0145 hours. Duration, 8 minutes 57 seconds. False data source, exercise scenario. 437B training tape, simulated Soviet launches, 2,200 1,400 ICBMs, 800 SLBMs. Alert level reached. National Command Authority notified U.S. Bomber engines started. Approximately 35 B-52s ICBM crews at launch stations. All Minuteman crews, 450 missiles. Presidential notification status. National Security Advisor briefed. Prepared to brief President. Held pending verification time to presidential decision. If attack assessed as real, estimated 2 to 5 minutes time. From presidential authorization to first launches, estimated 2 to 3 minutes. Total time from false alarm, start to potential launch, approximately 13 to 16 minutes, if presidential launch authorization had been given at estimated time. American missiles launched 450 Minuteman III ICBMs, 1 to 350 warheads. Soviet detection time, 2 minutes. Soviet counter-launch authorization time, 8 to 10 minutes. Soviet missiles launched, approximately 1,400 ICBMs, 5 times 500 warheads. American submarine launches, 192 SLBMs, 1,536 warheads. Soviet submarine launches, approximately 900 SLBMs, 2,800 warheads. Total weapons detonated, approximately 11,000 immediate casualties, 400 to 700 first-month casualties, 1 to 2 billion long-term casualties. 2 to 4 billion, percentage of human population killed, 50% to 80% cost of training tape, $12 cost of preventing nuclear war, 9 minutes of verification, margin of survival, sequential contact IDs noticed by one controller. The November 9th incident demonstrates that the greatest threat to human survival during the Cold War was not Soviet aggression or American first strike planning. It was the operational reality of maintaining thousands of nuclear weapons on alert status, ready to launch within minutes, responding to early warning systems subject to human error and technical failure, requiring decisions with civilization-ending consequences to be made in time frames measured in minutes based on information that might be catastrophically wrong. November 9th, 1979. Proved that the world could end not with deliberate malice, but with an operator grabbing the wrong tape in dim lighting at 01:18 hours in the morning. On November 9, 1979, at 01:18 hours, a NORAD computer operator reached into a tape storage rack in the dim lighting of the Cheyenne Mountain computer room. He pulled a magnetic tape. He believed it was 427ME software update, version 12.4. It was not. It was Exercise Scenario 437B, Maximum Coordinated Strike. At 01:20 hours, he loaded the tape into tape drive 4. At 01:25 hours, the computer warned, data format mismatch, verify tape identity. He overrode the warning. At 01:32 hours, the tape load completed. At 01:36 hours, the exercise scenario began playing on operational displays. At LE 136.03, the first red icon appeared on Lieutenant Colonel Pickford's screen. At ZLU 137:30, National Security Advisor Brzezinski was woken with notification that 2,000 Soviet missiles were inbound. For 9 minutes, NORAD believed the Soviet Union had launched its entire strategic arsenal. For 9 minutes, American nuclear forces prepared to retaliate. For 9 minutes, the world balanced on the edge of ending. At 01:45 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Pickford identified the false alarm. At 01:45:30, stand-down orders transmitted. At 01:47, operations returned to normal. The NORAD operator had inserted a training tape and convinced everyone Russia launched 200 missiles. Until verification procedures, analytical thinking and human judgment identified the error and saved the world. The margin was 9 minutes. The cause was one tape loaded into one computer by one operator who grabbed the wrong tape in dim lighting. The consequence, if the false alarm had not been identified, would have been nuclear war killing billions of people. The training tape incident taught the most important lesson of the nuclear age. The greatest danger is not enemy attack. It is the combination of imperfect systems, compressed decision time, and the requirement to make civilization-ending decisions in minutes. The NORAD operator inserted the wrong tape. The computer processed it as real. America prepared to launch, and only 9 minutes of verification stood between continued existence of human civilization and nuclear holocaust. November 9th, 1979. A NORAD operator inserted a training tape and convinced everyone Russia launched 2,200 missiles. For 9 minutes, it appeared that World War III had begun. For 9 minutes, the world stood on the edge of nuclear fire, and for 9 minutes, the only thing preventing the end of everything was a handful of people who insisted on verification, who noticed anomalies, who demanded confirmation before accepting that the unthinkable was real. The operator grabbed the wrong tape. The system believed it. The world almost ended. And we survived because Lieutenant Colonel John Pickford insisted on asking questions before accepting that 200 Soviet missiles were actually inbound. That's how close we came. One tape, 9 minutes, and the world survived.